introduce our author today, Soniah Kamal. She received star review in Library Journal and Publisher Weekly for her new book, Unmarriageable, Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan. I can tell you that this is a very good book. I read half of it already. Her first book, An Isolated Incident, won the KLF French Fiction Prize and Amazon Rising Star Award. Her essays and short story have become nominated for the Pushkar Prize and the Best Asian Story Series in 2017. Well, we're here to let's introduce to our author and let her talk about our book.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gwinnett County and Liberty Books, for having me here and for everyone coming out on this lovely sunny day. So when I was 14 years old, my Aunt Helen gave me a gorgeous copy of Pride and Prejudice. It was red leather with gold lettering on it. And I actually have it here with me today. And this is it. As you can see, very beautiful, a little worn for wear, but still very readable. And she gave this to me. I'm not sure if it was my birthday or what occasion it was, but it's inscribed by my cousins inside. And it's a 1978 or 1979 edition or so. So as I said, I was 14 years old and I got this. And very pretty, but I looked at how thick it was and I was a little scared. And then I opened it up to the first sentence, which is, as all Jane Austen lovers know, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. I promptly shut the novel. I was like, not only is this quite thick, I don't know what is going on in this. Luckily, though, I'd pick it up every so often just to flip through it because I had to, my aunt would ask me at some point, did you like it? And I had to say something. And what was inside were these illustrations called color plates. And here, as you can see, there's this woman standing under a doorway, and there are two other ladies and two gentlemen, and there's a caption. And I'd always wondered to myself, oh my God, I wonder what she's done, because the seated people look a little stunned. And me, myself, well, I was always getting into trouble also. I'd always done something or the other. So I sort of related to the pictures and all the captions. But it wasn't until I was 16 years old. And I don't know what it was about this particular day, but I just opened the novel, read that first sentence, and I just started reading it all the way through until the very end. Now, as soon as I finished reading it, the first thought I had was that this was the most quintessentially Pakistani novel that I had ever read in my life. I mean, Jane Austen had no idea she was Pakistani. Pakistan wasn't even a country that came about in 1947, so it wasn't even a country by then, but she was still Pakistani. And by that I mean, this is a story about a mother who is desperate for her 5 unmarried daughters to get married. And as wonderful as that was for me, Austen is a social critique. She writes comedy of manners. All of her books are full of irony, and she really nails human psychology. And for me, the humor in it, the satire in it, I mean, these were people I saw all around me all the time. In fact, Mrs. Bennet is my mother. Mrs. Bennet is almost every Pakistani mother who is out there. And as soon as I finished reading it, the first thought I had was, that this is, a Pakistani novel. And the second one was that one day I'm going to write a parallel retelling. I'm going to set Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan. Now, I'm not sure why I had this thought exactly. On the one hand, it was a very odd thought. On the other hand, a very fitting thought. But it was an odd thought because I never wanted to be a writer. Writing was something I did, people, you sing in the shower, you don't think you're going to go on and, become an opera star. You doodle, you don't think you're going to, paint and have things put up in a museum. And writing was the same way for me. I'd started scribbling stories and just telling stories and stuff when I was 8 years old. One of those very annoying kids who would, grab all the neighborhood kids, my cousins, my friends, my sister, and say, we're going to do this play today, and we're going to do that, and listen to me, I have a story. And everyone always hid from me. No, they didn't. They were very happy to indulge me. But writing was just a hobby, something I just did. I actually wanted to be an actress. And unfortunately, I even got offers as I grew a little older and from TV and dramas and stuff. But unfortunately, in my culture, in Pakistani culture, acting was not considered respectable. And I have to say, when I have a TEDx talk about the regret that I had because of my father didn't want me to do it. And I had a lot of regret that I hadn't been allowed to fulfill a dream of mine. In fact, my mother, who's a doctor, when I was 12 years old, I watched this movie called Umrao. It's an Indian movie, and it's about two little girls actually, who are kidnapped. And one is of a lighter complexion, one is of a darker complexion. And the lighter complexioned one goes on to be married to a Nawab, into a wealthy family, and the darker complexioned one is sold into prostitution. And the movie, which is based on a real story, follows the prostitute's life. And at the very end, she comes to dance at her home, her childhood home, which she recognizes. And her brother and her mother recognize her. Instead of taking her back, the brother kicks her out, even though the mother wants to take her back in. And something about the story at that age, it just resonated with me. There was something so sad and alluring about the fact that without any fault of her own, she was not in control of her own destiny. She had no agency. And watching that movie, I felt that I wanted to portray roles like that. I wanted to be an actress. Anyway, so my mother came home that day. I told her, really excited that I know what I want to do. And she gave me one slap and she was like, your father is going to die, because this was such a taboo thing in our culture at that point. In Muslim culture, it was just not considered respectable. And every time I tell this story, there's always someone or the other who tells me that, about in America, their mothers who wanted to be flight attendants, or they wanted to go on the stage, or they wanted to be singers, or they wanted a career. And they weren't allowed to because everyone was scared that if they became, if they had agency or they became flight attendants or whatever, they wouldn't go on to become good housewives and good housemakers and homemakers and good mothers and stuff. So I think being denied your dream might be, universal in some respect everywhere. But so writing was something I just fell into. I'd been doing it for a long time, and it was socially sanctioned. My parents never had an issue with me writing, because as much in acting, your entire body and your face is out there. Used to be back in the day, some of you might remember, that authors, pre-internet, authors really didn't have you didn't see authors' faces anywhere at all. I mean, even with books, except for perhaps Barbara Cartland, if anyone remembers Barbara Cartland at the back of her books in her pink frilly dresses, and maybe some of the thriller writers, but otherwise, whatever book you picked up, there'd be a small bio, if even that, and you wouldn't know what the author looked like. So traditionally, it was very okay to write, because even if you bared your soul on the page, no one knew what you looked like. So it was absolutely fine. You were hidden and veiled from view. So I'd always been writing, and something I just did had a very resentful relationship to it for the longest time, because it was something my parents were okay with. And that's what my TEDx talk is about too. Regrets are bad enough, but when they're regrets given to you by your parents or your culture or people saying no to you, it's one thing to try something and fail. It's another thing to never even be allowed to try it. So I fell into writing, and writing chose me, in a way. Now, when I was, I've had an interesting upbringing. When I was 6 months old, my family moved to England. When I was 9 years old, we moved to Saudi Arabia. When I was 16, we moved back to Pakistan. Then I came out to college. But those years in Saudi Arabia, I went to a British international school, and it was almost going to a mini United Nations. My friends were from everywhere. They were from the African continent. They were from Scandinavia. They were from the US, England, Japan, every country that you can possibly think of. There was representation there, and I absolutely loved it. But the most wonderful thing about this school was the library. Now, had I just remained in Pakistan, which was under the British Empire and is a post-colonial country, and in fact, Pakistan adopted, the British implemented the English education system over there, or had I just stayed in England, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the name Enid Blyton. She's a very prolific British author, especially back in the day. You know, as popular as J.K. Rowling is today, everyone across the, you know, if you were any connection to England, you read her. She had 500 plus books to her name, writing for kindergartners, fantasy series, you know, to teenage and beyond, mysteries and boarding house, boarding school stuff, and all sorts of stories. And you basically just grew up on Enid Blyton with a few other authors thrown in. Now, because I was at this school, which was British and American, we had books from all over the world. So I also grew up reading Judy Blume and S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders, from Canada, Ellen Montgomery, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, Daphne du Maurier. My friends from India would bring with them what would now be considered graphic novels, these comics called Amar Chitrakatha. I had friends from Japan, Korea, China, bringing in folk tales and myths, Russian friends bringing in tales about Baba Yaga. It was the, you know, we read the Arabian Nights. It was just the most wonderful, wonderful upbringing when it came to books and even television. I mean, I grew up watching The Cosby Show, but this I know tells my age, but The Cosby Show and Punky Brewster and you know, what else was there? Full House. So, you know, so it was a very eclectic upbringing in terms of pop culture and media, which I would not have gotten had I just grown up in Pakistan or England or even just the US. Because there are a lot of, you know, British children and stuff who've grown up there are not, and now that the internet's here, we all read pretty much the same stuff for the most part, or we're all exposed to it. But back in the day, no one knew who Judy Blume might be or who S.E. Hinton was. So, you know, I got this wonderful upbringing when it came to books and readings. But the one thing that I was lacking, which I slowly realized, is that there was no book at that time that was written in English and set in Pakistan. Now, the reason that I'm even speaking in English is to do with British Empire, its presence in the Indian subcontinent, and and colonialism. Even when the British came, they implemented the English language and English education system. It was the language of opportunity and privilege. And I'm going to read one of my epigraphs over here to give you an idea of how things were implemented. So this is from Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute on Education, given to British Parliament, a speech in 1835. He says, "I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic. I have never found one among them, Orientalists, who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The intrinsic superiority of the Western literature, we are free to employ our funds as we choose, that we ought to employ them in teaching what is best worth knowing, that English is better worth knowing than Sanskrit or Arabic, that it is possible to make natives of this country thoroughly good English scholars, and that to this end our efforts ought to be directed. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country." So the policy was basically to create confused human beings who were perhaps of one skin color and tone, and yet their sensibilities and perhaps their loyalties lay elsewhere. And in fact, in my Seattle launch and reading, the interviewer said that Unmarriageable and I were Babington's worst nightmare because, you know, he wanted to create confusion, and instead I created fusion with Unmarriageable and reoriented and reclaimed what was being the reclaimed identity. So the British came, they implemented English, and when they left in 1947, and Pakistan, a sovereign nation, came into being, Pakistan decided to keep English as one of its official languages. So you either grew up in the English medium system, which is your education was in English, or you grew up in an Urdu medium system, another language in Pakistan. And this created a linguistic divide actually with across the classes, and that's one of the things that is discussed in Unmarriageable also. I happened to grow up in the English medium system, and I was a British literature student, so I read all the classics. I read Austen and Thomas Hardy, John Donne, Keats, all of them, and Shakespeare. You can't escape Shakespeare. There's Shakespeare, 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 and more Shakespeare. So when I was 16 years old and I finally read Pride and Prejudice, loved it, thought it was Pakistani, it was perhaps weird for me to think that, okay, now I'm going to one day write this, because I didn't want to be a writer. But it was not so weird, because what I'd started to also do while I was in Saudi Arabia, in that lovely library, reading all these things, was that I'd started to automatically remap places and food and things and clothes in all the literature that I was reading. So for instance, if I would read of Anne of Green Gables in P.E. Island, I would automatically transfer her to somewhere in Pakistan. If I was reading about bonnets, I would think dupattas, or shawls. If I read sandwiches or scones, I would immediately turn them into samosas. So I became very adept at, just retransferring everything into the culture that I was part of. So it was a bridge between the two worlds that I was reading. So yes, I wasn't a writer, never planned to be a writer, but also I was already doing this, and I wanted to read something that was set in Pakistan but was in English. Now the thing is, like I said, my mother is Mrs. Bennett. There was a lot of pressure, and there remains a lot of pressure in Pakistan on girls to get married. Pakistan is a contemporary society, and it has come a long way. We've had a head of state, Benazir Bhutto. Malala Yousafzai is a Nobel laureate. We recently had a winner on Chopped, the Food Network. Unfortunately, Fatima Ali, she unfortunately passed away. We have a cricket team, women's cricket team. We have sports players. My own mother's a doctor. We have bankers, lawyers, highly accomplished women who can earn their own income and certainly don't need to get married at all. And yet, the pressure remains there, no matter what you do. When I came out to college in the US, and I was a valedictorian, and I happened to meet my husband around that same time, and my mother came out, and any guesses for what excited her more? The valedictorian. Oh yeah, the valedictorian was the big thing. No, she was really happy that finally there was, I was going to get married. And this pressure is, the thing is, in a lot of traditional cultures, marriage is very important. It's your gateway to having children. It's you have to get married to have a relationship. And I've a lot of traditional cultures, such as the Jewish culture, Italian, Greek, Russian. A lot of the traditional cultures are still very marriage focused, which is why I think Jane Austen is as universally loved as she is, because everyone can relate to the love stories in her novels, and the fact that these five sisters need to get married. That said, I personally don't really think Jane Austen herself was very interested in the marriage plot per se, or even her love stories. I mean, none of her novels start with for instance, Pride and Prejudice doesn't start with Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy looking at each other across the room at all. None of her novels do. She is more interested in drawing room hypocrisy, in breaking down social structures, in questioning keeping up appearances and why this is important and what that does to people. And that was why I fell in love with her Austen's work and her novels also. That was that was my gateway into everywhere I looked. I could see Austen's characters. And there's one part in the novel where my Elizabeth Bennet, Alice, has gone to a wedding, and everywhere she looks, she sees characters from different novels. In fact, and her best friend Charlotte Lucas calls herself Helena from one of Shakespeare's plays, because Helena is a woman who is finding it difficult to find someone to marry. Now, my favorite character in all of Austen's novels is Charlotte Lucas. And for those of you who have read Pride and Prejudice, Charlotte is Elizabeth Bennet's best friend. She's in Austen's time, 200 years ago, she's 27 years old. She's well past her prime. I mean, in Regency England, in Austen's time, women could not work at all. There was except the only way for them to achieve any financial security at all was to get married and to marry well. In Austen's class herself, Austen's mother was from the nobility and her father was a reverend. But the only job Austen could possibly do was that of governess, coming from her class. And if any of you have read Emma, then you know exactly Austen's feelings about being a governess. Jane Fairfax in that novel is supposed to be one, and Austen is not happy with that, and neither is Jane Fairfax. Reason being that being a governess puts you in a very in-between space. You were neither a servant, like you weren't a kitchen maid, which would tell you what your place was, but you were neither nobility or part of the aristocracy. You were still an employee. You were still being paid. So you're in a very in-between space of neither being here nor there. You wouldn't know who to eat with, who to eat your meals with. You wouldn't know where you fit in. It wasn't the most comfortable of things to do. And this was the only career open for women of Austen's class. So getting married was extremely crucial in the Regency period. And if you didn't get married and you had no roof over your head, which is what happened to Austen and her sister and her mother. In fact, if anyone has watched Downton Abbey, the whole series starts on the crux that the elder sister is engaged, the fiancé dies on the Titanic, and the entire Downton Abbey passes on to a cousin they don't even know. And this is the same thing that would have happened to the Bennet sisters in Pride and Prejudice. Once their father passed away, the entire property, their house Longbourn, would have gone to Mr. Collins, who is not the most dashing hero in Austen's work. But you know, Jane Austen is a very modern writer, I feel, because in all of her novels, all of her heroines say no to some proposal. But in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet says no to two proposals, one by the bumbling fool Mr. Collins and one by the bumbling arrogant Mr. Darcy. And in Austen's time, that was a pretty big deal because once their father died, once Mr. Bennet passed away, the girls would have no way to sustain themselves, a roof over their head, food. They could have literally been out on the street. And in fact, this is something that could have happened to Austen and her sister and her mother herself. I mean, when I teach Jane Austen, and in fact in the first chapter of Unmarriageable, this comes up. My Elizabeth Bennet and Jane Bennet are school teachers. All of my women in Unmarriageable are working women earning their own. But it's set in a classroom, and one of the students, my Elizabeth Bennet is teaching Pride and Prejudice, and one of the students says, "Oh, poor Jane Austen, she never got married." And my Alice says that, well, actually, a really wealthy man named Harris Bigwither did propose to her one evening, but then the very next morning Jane said no. And you know, like sometimes when you're asked in quizzes and stuff, what is the one place in history you'd like to be, or the one conversation you'd like to hear? For me, it's honestly that overnight, what the hell happened that night for her to go from yes to no. And I really want to know what her mother had to say about that. And you know, Austen's sister Cassandra was also engaged, but her fiancé was in the Navy, and he died abroad of a sickness. So both the sisters never married. Jane said no to her proposals, and Cassandra never got married after that. And once their father passed away, they actually did go from house to house to house. And it wasn't until Jane's brother, Edward Knight, who had been adopted by a very wealthy set of relatives, which is why his name changed from Austen to Knight. And he was able to give them Chawton Cottage to live in, where Jane wrote a lot of her novels and stuff at the end of her life. So, funnily enough, even though she didn't want to be dependent on a male income and she didn't get married, she nevertheless did need the help of her father and then her brother, which is a very interesting twist about how you gain agency or still keep some sort of independence in a culture or an era or a time period where you don't have many choices. And another thing that always fascinated me about Pride and Prejudice was the role that Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet play in it. Often people think that, Mrs. Bennet is the world's worst mother, and, she's just worried about one thing, and Mr. Bennet is a really good father, and Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet are so close. And it, I think, seems that way, especially with the movies, because they sort of play Mrs. Bennet as a caricature. But when you think about it, Mrs. Bennet just wants her daughter, Elizabeth, to get married to Mr. Collins, who is going to inherit their property. They will have a roof over their head, it's security. And it's Mr. Bennet who makes the startling statement of, oh, no, you don't have to marry anyone at all, or you don't have to marry Mr. Collins at least, because he's not leaving them much, and he is actually giving his daughter very bad advice when it comes to that. In modern times, of course, we're looking at things through the lens of love. And, she's not in love with Mr. Collins, so it makes sense to us. But in practical terms, in practical times, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Bennet is just as much not a good father as Mrs. Bennet might not have been a good mother. And I really love the whole play about what it means to be a good parent in Pride and Prejudice. And I did, I bought a lot of that up in Unmarriageable also. My favorite character of all of Austen's work is Charlotte Lucas, because I feel that Charlotte Lucas is the one character who, in Pride and Prejudice, has complete agency of who she is and what she wants to do. My novel, Unmarriageable, it's not a continuation and it's not an inspiration. An inspired by would be, Lydia Bennet and Wickham, and when they run off, to Gretna Green, what happened there, or taking one of the characters and writing a completely different story. And a continuation, a prequel or sequel, would be something like the end of Pride and Prejudice, and how was Elizabeth and Darcy's marriage? How did it work out after the book finished? My take on Pride and Prejudice is a parallel retelling. And I very consciously use the word parallel because it hits every single plot point. I wanted to, at 16, read a novel told in English, set in Pakistan, and I loved Pride and Prejudice, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to read Pride and Prejudice set in Pakistani culture and society. So it hits every plot point, but something that always fascinated me, even that first time I read it at 16, was Elizabeth Bennet, as we know, says no to Mr. Collins. And Austen tells us that Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend, went down to meet Mr. Collins accidentally in the lane. And the very next sentence pretty much is about how he proposed and now they're getting married. And I'd always wondered what happened between these two sentences, I mean, did he propose to her the very same way he proposed to her best friend a day back? What happened over here? Another character that fascinated me was Anne de Bourgh, Catherine de Bourgh's daughter. She is completely silent in Pride and Prejudice. And I'd always wondered, does she ever say anything? And if she does, what does she say? So I wanted to give her a voice also. I wanted to work with the backstories and of a lot of the minor characters, the secondary characters like Anne and Charlotte. And so even though it's a parallel retelling and it hits every plot point, and I think it's the only parallel retelling to date, actually, I spruced up the minor characters, their backgrounds. I gave their new characters in Pride and Unmarriageable also. Mr. Bennet has his own arc with an elder brother. But what I loved about Charlotte Lucas and her character was somehow she manages to take agency of her own life. She accidentally meets Mr. Collins in the street. She gets him to somehow propose to her. And then when she tells Elizabeth, Elizabeth is not happy about this. And the most phenomenal thing for me was that usually, when you're making a major life decision and one of your friends says that's not a good idea, you tend to listen or you tend to pay some attention, but Charlotte Lucas knew what was best for her own life. She didn't come under peer pressure. She didn't let Elizabeth's opinion of Mr. Collins veer her off the path of what she knew was best for her. And I really, really admired that spirit. Charlotte didn't want to stay a spinster in her own house, in her father's house. She probably knew she was never going to get a proposal that might have been acceptable or get a proposal at all. And she went out, and she seems to have almost in modern times times proposed herself, So Austen also was Austen in her, herself in her novels and Pride and Prejudice. She was such a modern writer in that way. Whatever little bit of agency she could give her characters in whatever little bit of way. I mean, when we think about it, even Lydia takes her life into her own hands and she runs away. Now, thankfully, Mr. Darcy's money is able to get her married off, or she could have been in a lot of trouble had she come back home unmarried and maybe even, pregnant. But all of Austen's characters had some agency. And at 16, reading that, those things resonated with me. Her satire resonated with me, and I really wanted to set this novel in modern day contemporary Pakistan, which was actually more of a challenge than I thought it would be. Usually when you write anything at all, I've written essays, I've written short stories. You write for yourself. You don't think of the audience. You don't think of who else is going to read this. You just hope that whatever you read is going to resonate with enough people, or even one person, that they'll pick it up and read it. Now, with Pride and Prejudice, I had a very different, I knew that at least there are a group of people, if anyone is familiar, called Janeites. Janeites are avid fans of all things Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, and they know their Jane inside out. And what I was planning to do was pretty ambitious, because this was a parallel retelling. Like I said, it wasn't an inspiration, it wasn't a continuation, it wasn't something that I thought would be cute to do. This was me reclaiming my identity, reorienting Pride and Prejudice, and as well as a parallel. And I thought that there was going to be at least one Janeite, one avid fan of Jane Austen in this entire world, who's going to pick up this book that I would like to write, and they're going to have an opinion about it. And that was really intimidating. The other thing I really wanted to do also was write a novel that, even if you're not familiar with Jane Austen at all, and you have never read Pride and Prejudice, it would still be a complete book for you. So I wanted to write something that was a completely original novel, and it could stand on its, stand alone. So yes, there was the Jane Austen aspect, but there was also wanting to write an original novel. The other two groups of people who I thought would pick it up and were intimidating also was, often it happens that we learn about, or we know about different countries from what we see on the news blips that, the news clips, the news blips. I mean, most people, the little they know about Pakistan comes from what they see on the news, which is certainly not a 360-degree picture. I mean, for instance, when I was growing up in Pakistan in the 1980s, I had come to, I'd come to the U.S. before, visited Disneyland, was aware of what America was. But if you hadn't come, all you'd know about America was probably Baywatch, and people would think that all of you have red bikinis and are running merrily on the beach all day long. And also soap operas. We would get soap operas like The Bold and Beautiful and Santa Barbara, Dynasty, Dallas, and as we all know, in a lot of these soap operas, people seem to be having a very good time all the time with everyone, it seems. So you would have, you'd have a father-in-law hooking up with his daughter-in-law, and it would seem that America is the place to go if you want to truly express yourself. But which is obviously not the case. But when you just see a country through pop culture or through what you see on the news, you don't get a whole picture of it. So I wanted to write something which would resonate with, which was the Pakistan that I had grown up with, an authentic Pakistan, one that where girls go out to cafes and have coffee and discuss their mothers who want to marry them off to just about anyone, and about guys who are good looking and wealthy but really arrogant. So are they any good? And for me, I have to say, one of the things I do bring up in Unmarriageable is the concept of whether it's important to be in love or whether it's important to be in like with whoever you're going to, end up with. And that was something that I really wanted to explore in the novel. So the last bunch of people that I was really intimidated by were actual Pakistanis and people from the Indian subcontinent who were, they know their culture. So there were these four balls that I was juggling. There were the Janeites, avid Jane Austen fans. There were people who had never heard of Jane Austen at all and would be coming to Unmarriageable as a complete standalone novel. There were people who knew Pakistan through what they'd seen on the news. And then there were people who were Pakistani and knew it inside out. And I was extremely intimidated by all these. So they were like gargoyles I'd always see with, one or the other saying, you won't be able to do it, you won't be able to do it. And then it so happened that my first novel, An Isolated Incident, was having trouble getting published in the US. And I decided that I would go back and do my master's, and I would go the teaching route. And I joined Georgia State University, and my youngest was 4 at that time. I have 3 kids now. Right now they're 17, 16, and 10, but he was 4 at the time. And it was a 4-year full-time master's program with 4-hour closed books exams at the end, 40 books, 4-hour exams, closed book, and it was not fun at all with 3 kids and with all the other responsibilities that one has. But nowadays, if you plan to teach, you need a master's or at least a PhD. So I forged forth, and being a Pakistani, I didn't know that I could quit, because there's no such word as quitting in the Indian subcontinent. You just start something and you finish it to the end. An Isolated Incident, my first novel, took me 10 years to write. It's set against the Kashmir conflict. It's about a 19-year-old girl who gets caught up in Kashmir in very sad circumstances. She's gang raped. Her family is murdered. She finds herself passed on from family to family until she ends up in the US at a very distant uncle's house. They have a 19-year-old son who's very idealistic. He's grown up in the US suburbia. His parents are doctors. He's really seen comfort all his life, but he's very idealistic. He believes he's a combination of every Marvel, DC comic superhero there is, and that, he can save the world. And of course, these are 2 19-year-olds. Things happen, and he goes out into the world to save the world. She's already broken. And the novel is about what it means to have everything and lose it, and to have nothing, and how do you find something to live. My grandfather is a refugee from Kashmir. And on pretty much his deathbed, like I said, I'd always been scribbling, and my family thought I was going to be a journalist. So on pretty much his deathbed, he asked me to write about Kashmir. And it so happened I turned into a novelist. But since I'd promised him, and I wanted to honor that promise, An Isolated Incident came out of that promise. And it took 10 years, a lot of research involved and stuff. Now, Unmarriageable, on the other hand, was written in 2 months. As hard as doing a 4 years master's at Georgia State was, and I got funding and a scholarship, so quitting was just not in my vocabulary. I finished the exams, and usually after your coursework, with a creative writing degree, you have to deliver a novel or short stories. I finished my coursework, and usually you have 1 year to 2 years to work on your novel or your short stories. It so happened there was a glitch in the syllabus, and I had 2 months. And this was dead smack. I had my TEDx talk in the middle too. And if anyone knows anything about TEDx, you have to, or TED Talks, you have to memorize those talks. So here I was having to write a novel and having to memorize that. And somehow I just managed to forge through. And I think, we talk about a cloud and silver lining. For me, it turned out to be all silver, and the cloud was the lining. Because, like I said, I was so intimidated to tackle Pride and Prejudice, to take this beloved classic, and I'll go as far as to say not just a beloved classic, world classic, but perhaps the most beloved world classic. Sorry Shakespeare and Shaw, sorry Dickens, but Austen and Pride and Prejudice seem to have won at this point. And to reorient it and to take it and set it in a different culture, I was really intimidated. Those 2 months, I had to I had to deliver a thesis. I didn't have time to think of Jainites and standalones or Pakistanis, non-Pakistanis, anyone at all. I just focused completely on the task at hand. And I thought that I would, write something and it would be a bit of a messy draft. And, as first drafts tend to be, I delivered it on deadline, the syllabus also said you have to give in 80,000 words. So in those, I wrote 80,000 words. I turned them in. My family and we all went out for dinner, celebrated, yay, I'm done. A week later, I get an email from one of my professors saying, I turned in 80,000 words, half the novel. He was like, where's the rest? And I was like, what do you mean, where's the rest? And he was like, yeah, you have to deliver an entire novel, which is when we realized that, and I was like, oh my God. And I managed to write another 80,000 words and finish the entire novel. So what I basically wrote in 2 months was 160,000 words. I actually became quite ill by the end of it. I don't know how I did it. But I turned it in, and it should have been a mess. And instead, my professors wrote back, and they said, send it on to your literary agent. And I sent it on, and it sold within a few days. And so, the great big silver in this cloud was that, I was able to do what I call my dream novel. Because from 16 to have that little root of an idea that one day I'm going to do this, and then to finally see it happen, to finally write it, despite all the readers I was intimidated by, despite my own qualms of whether I would be able to write Pride and Prejudice through a feminist lens, through a post-colonial lens, and yet keep the humor and the irony, and I hope I was able to achieve that, and and be true to Austen's spirit also. And along the way, those 2 months, I didn't have time to, I had thought I would have a year, 2 years. I was going to leisurely, make myself cups of tea and had to buy, try every cookie in the universe and reread Pride and Prejudice and make notes. And I had no time at all to do any of that. What I did do, the only little bit of a break I gave myself was I asked my best friend Shika, who was a poet, and my niece, who was 21 at the time, and my sister-in-law in Pakistan, my niece and sister-in-law, and I was like, I'm going to send you, I have to write this novel. I don't have any time. I'm going to be sending you these really long emails every day. And, just tell me if you think they're any good. It's a story, it's a novel. Just tell me if you think it's making sense even. Now, my best friend, who is a writer herself, she immediately knew what she was getting into. So she was like, okay. But the other two were like, oh yeah, send it along. And I think the first couple of emails, because I would literally send like 5,000 to 8,000 words or something in that, ballpark figure per day. And I think the first couple of emails, they were all like, what the hell did we just get ourselves into? But I knew I had something there. When I think 10 days or so into this, I got the emails from them back to back, and each of them was like, where's the rest? Where's the next chapter? And I was like, oh, I haven't written the next chapter yet. And they were so interested and invested after a while, and they talk about the characters if they were real people. And that was very, very encouraging to me too, because I knew that, okay, I wasn't making a complete mess of what I was trying to do here. I guess it was meant to be, and here we are. I'm going to read the beginning of Unmarriageable. So chapter 1. Part 1, December 2000, chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a girl can go from pauper to princess or princess to pauper in the mere seconds it takes for her to accept a proposal. When Elizabeth Bennet began working at age 20 as the English literature teacher at the British School of Dalipabad, she had thought it would be a temporary solution to the sudden turn of fortune that had seen Mr. Barkat Bark Bennet and Mrs. Khushbu Pinky Bennet and their 5 daughters, Janisba, Elizabeth, Mirizba, Kitiyara, and Lady, move from big city Lahore to backward Dalipabad. But here she was, 10 years later, 30 years old, and still in the job she'd grown to love despite its challenges. Her new batch of 9th graders was starting Pride and Prejudice, and their first homework had been to rewrite the opening sentence of Jane Austen's novel, always a fun activity and a good way for her to get to know her students better. After Alice took attendance, she opened a fresh box of multicolored chalks and invited the girls to share their sentences on the blackboard. The first to jump up was Rose Nama, a crusader for duty and decorum, and one of the more trying students. Rose Nama deliberately bypassed the colored chalks for a plain white one, and Alice braced herself for a reimagined sentence exalting a traditional life: marriage, children, death. As soon as Rose Nama ended with mere seconds it takes for her to accept a proposal, the class erupted into cheers. For it was true. A ring did possess magical powers to transform into pauper or princess. Rose Nama gave a curtsy and, glancing defiantly at Alice, returned to her desk. "Good job," Alice said. "Who wants to go next?" As hands shot up, she looked affectionately at the girls at their wooden desks, their winter uniforms impeccably washed and pressed by dhobis and maids, their long braids, for good girls did not get a boyish cut like Alice, draped over their books, and she wondered who they'd end up becoming by the end of high school. She recalled herself at their age, an eager to learn, though ultimately naive Miss Know-it-all. "Miss Alice, me," the class clown said, pumping her hand energetically. Alice nodded, and the girls selected a blue chalk and began to write. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a young girl in possession of a pretty face, a fair complexion, a slim figure, and good height is not going to happily settle for a very ugly husband if he doesn't have enough money, unless she has the most incredible bad luck, which my cousin does. So, one of the other blessings that came with finally writing Unmarriageable was when it sold to Penguin Random House. My literary agent at that time, it sold now two years ago. It takes, you sell a novel and then it takes at least a year to 2 years for it to come on the shelf. So when it sold, my literary agent asked if I wanted to do the audio version. The audio sold and he asked if I wanted to do it. And I said, absolutely not. I'm not an actress, let alone, with acting, at least you have your facial expressions, you have your body, and with audio, it's just your voice. You need vocal training, and I don't come from that background. So I was like, absolutely not, and I'm really looking forward to see who they choose to narrate the novel. A year and a half later, a week before we were supposed to be in studio, I got an email from Linda Korn, the executive producer at Penguin Random House, and she said that, I've watched your TEDx talk and I think you can do this. And I was like, well, that's really nice of you, but I don't want to do this. I told her I'm not an actress. And she said, you know what? And she said something then that really, really touched my heart. I hadn't thought of it. And she said, you know what? Imagine this is the dream that you weren't allowed to fulfill, your dream of acting, and your reality, which is writing, and it's bringing the two together. And the fusion of that, which is what Unmarriageable and Pride and Prejudice also is, the fusion of the English language I grew up in and the culture that I grew up in. And something about her bringing those two aspects of my life together too really touched me. And I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. I figured, what's the worst they can do? I'll go into studio, they'll hold me for 2 minutes and they'll kick me out. But you have to give a bit of a tape, you have to do some audition and send it in. So I found myself in the studio. It was 10 hours, a little more of recording, one take, and it was the biggest. I loved it. It was such a gift. I was a little sad after that because I figured, if I could have done this just vocal, I could have, as Marlon Brando says in his movie On the Waterfront, I could have been a contender maybe with acting too. But just to be able to have done this, to have gone into it, taken a bit of a dream I had and combined it with the writing and stuff. But it was 4 days, 10 hours. It's really tough. I don't know if I'd want to do it again, but so far this journey has been just really, really wonderful. And I'm so happy it's culminated in my love of Austin, my being able to reorient and reclaim identity, a post-colonial identity, and set Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan. So thank you. Yeah, I'd love to take questions.
Okay, so I have read a lot of continuation you talk about, even read Pride and Prejudice and Zombie.
So far,
Okay.
that was interesting.
Yeah.
So far, I really like your retelling on it.
Thank
It's
you.
very plot to plot. And one
Yeah,
of the things
thank
I really like about the book is the mention of religions that you incorporate into it between Christian and Hindu at the same time. So how do you want to put that into the book? Like, with the original Pride and Prejudice really doesn't have a lot of religious element to it. And this one, you do put some religious element in it, which make it interesting because it kind of bleed into the whole marriage and your role and everything. So how do you feel about putting religion into it?
Sure. Well, Pride and Prejudice does have religion in it. I mean, Austen's father was a reverend, and in all of her novels, she has clergymen. Mr. Collins is a clergyman, and he's not the most popular hero in the novel. He's a bit self-righteous. So, and Austen, I thought she did a great job with, she exposed the self-righteousness that comes in religion. And I very much wanted to take that aspect of hers. I mean, mine is a parallel retelling, not just in the plot to plot, but it's also a parallel retelling in other aspects. For instance, the reason I have my Lydia Bennet is named Lady Bennet is because Austen first started publishing. In her lifetime, she never published under her own name. It wasn't until she passed away and then her brother, told everyone who she was. But her first novel was published by a lady, and I wanted to have that nod over there. My novel Unmarriageable is set in 2000 and 2001 because often one of the big critiques that Austen tends to get, one of the few critiques, is that she didn't bring the larger world events into her novels. It's not that she had brothers in the Navy. Her cousin Eliza was married to a French aristocrat who was guillotined. She lived through the Napoleonic Wars. So, a lot of things were happening around her, and she was very well aware of them. And in Pride and Prejudice alone, the militia, the army is in town, which is why Lydia and her Kitty, the two sisters, are so excited because they keep, they're excited about flirting with the soldiers. So it's not as if Austen avoided it completely, but it was not something that she dwelled on. But as we all know, in 2001, a major world event happened. And one of my sections in Unmarriageable ends in August 2001. And I figured a reader would now expect that this major world event was going to be, if not a big part of the book, at least some part of the book. And there is no mention of it. And the reason I did that was to show a contemporary reader how Austen also did not bring in the larger world events into her novels. And I wanted them to have a parallel of that. So I tried to do a lot of parallels, not just the plot by plot parallel. But religion, Pakistan is a multi-religious country. Islam is the majority religion, but we have Hindus, Sikhs, Christians. In fact, there's a inter-religious marriage in the novel. My gardeners are Muslim and Christian. They're married, and as we know in Austen's novels, gardeners are a very happy, thriving family with kids. In fact, the children that the gardeners have in Unmarriageable are named after my own children. I like giving. Austen used to name a lot of her characters after her friend, like her best friend Anne Sharp or her sister Jane, or she'd give characters names from just namesakes from her own life. And I did the same in An Isolated Incident and in Unmarriageable. So my children show up, my husband is in there, my best friend is there, I'm there. I'm actually Harris Bigwither's girlfriend. I figured that Charlotte Lucas marries Elizabeth Bennet's spurn suitor. I'm perfectly happy being the girlfriend of Jane Austen's spurn suitor in the novel. But I do. One of my scenes is set at the Wagah border between India and Pakistan. So I do bring politics in like that. And religion is, I don't necessarily discuss religion, but the Islamic faith has shown we have people reading the Quran, and we have people praying, and marriage comes up in terms of divorce, that women have the right to divorce in Islam. So I try to bring in a lot of religion that way, as well as show minority religions also, through the gardeners, especially through their relationship, because that's how that's what Pakistan is. I wanted to show, like I said, a Pakistan that I've grown up in, that I've lived in. I went to a convent in Pakistan growing up. I went to another school where we had an American teacher and every assembly she would start with the Lord's Prayer, and then we'd say a Muslim prayer. So it's a secular upbringing. It's our roots are, but there are a lot of religions in Pakistan. So I wanted to reflect that in the novel as best as I could. I think, of course, minorities can have a tough time in any country and culture, as we see here, and everywhere. But and another thing I also wanted to bring up through in Unmarriageable was the connection between Eastern and Western literatures. The universalities, the bridge, the way novels or books and stories can mirror each other. So we have, and one of the this is something that my Elizabeth Bennett and Mr. Darcy discuss a lot about Western literature, Eastern literature. What does it mean when we say a literature belongs to the Western canon or Eastern canon? For instance, I connect a Passage to India by E.M. Forster, who was a British guy, with Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. They're both about they have a lot in common. Then there's Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan with John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. I do a lot of connections here. Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye comes up. One of the characters accidentally calls it The Blackest Eye. Leslie Marmon Silko's short story Lullaby comes up, and it's a lovely story about Native American children being taken away from their tribes and being sent to boarding schools where they weren't allowed to speak their tribal language, and they had to learn English. So once again, the linguistic divides, empire, colonialism, what it means to not have your language or your culture or who your identity. So a lot of these things are in there, and religion is one of those aspects that I talk about and bring up too. It's a fun novel, and I've been told it's really funny. In fact, a lot of magazines have called it, the funny one, and people tend to laugh when they read it. So I don't mean to make it sound terribly serious, but there is a serious strain in it. In fact, I was really, one of the most thrilling things for me was that this student, Yonka Delgado, wrote an essay for Plowshares about Unmarriageable, and she wrote it through the lens of the epigraphs. Epigraphs are quotes that writers put in the beginning of books, and they're usually guidelines for how to read the books. Most people either skip over them or don't realize their importance, but she took the epigraphs. I have the one I read out from Thomas Babington Macaulay about language, and then I have one from Jane to her sister Cassandra, where she's talking about how Pride and Prejudice is her light, bright, and sparkling novel. And that's another thing I wanted to parallel, And Jane was worried about whether there was enough shade in it, whether she needed to put more heavy subjects in it. And, so she wrote an essay about Unmarriageable through light, bright, and sparkling, and shade, and the epigraphs, and that's just wonderful because most people pass over them, and I was so excited when I found that. So yeah, I tried to do a lot with the novel, but it's a fun novel. It's Austen's light, bright, and sparkling with shade underneath. Yeah.
When did you write it? What year did you write it?
When did I write it? 2 years ago. The first draft, yeah, and like I said, it takes a good year to 2 years to 1.5 years. It came out just this past January 22nd, 2019. So yeah, a year and a half ago. But by the time they do the cover, the editing, the line editing, I was lucky in that there wasn't a lot of structural editing that we had to do. I'd managed to write a novel that what we did have to do, though, was because, like I said, I delivered 160,000 words. So I literally delivered, usually books are 300 pages or so. I delivered a 600-page book. So it was double this in those 2 months. And what I wanted to do for myself also was power it down and just make it a regular size. So in edits, what I had to work on was deciding what to what to pare down. And a lot of the post-colonial discussions did get cut. A lot of the descriptions of Pakistan and the places that the characters go, those got cut too. But, so that was a challenge. I mean, for some writers, it's a challenge. Adding words is a challenge. For me, cutting words down seems to be the big challenge. But yeah.
What are you working on now?
At the moment, I have a million ideas. I think in some way I'm a little rested, because if an isolated incident was my promise to my grandfather, writing Unmarriageable was very much a promise I think I'd made to myself at 16, and with 2 promises out of the way. And also my kids, I tend to write very heavy things usually. You know, as with Isolated Incident, it's about war and terrorism and healing. And I have short stories about elderly immigrants in the U.S. and otherwise, and how, you know, how they adjust. Because it's one thing when you come as a young person and you know, your whole life is before you, but when you come when you're an older person and suddenly you're in a new country and you have to adjust, or you know, where do you eventually want to be buried, back where you're from or over here. I write a lot about sexual misunderstanding between cultures in my short stories and essays and stuff. So, you know, I have so many ideas. I really don't know. And right now I'm just so busy with just, you know, going around and talking about, and which I'm really Unmarriageable, which I'm really, really happy that I'm being invited to a lot of places. So it can get a bit tiring, but it's been a journey so far. So yeah, I really haven't thought about what I want to do next. I have to say, I'm a little spoilt now, having written one book in 10 years, one novel in 10 years, and another in 2 months. I prefer the 2 months. So now I expect to just sit down and just scribble everything. In fact, 2 months is too much. I want to just write a novel in a month and a half and have it be, you know, good to go. And so I think I'm a little if intimidated by, that's my new intimidation. So we'll see what happens with that. Mm-hmm.
What were some of your differences in your publishing experiences between your 2 novels?
Oh, very much. An Isolated Incident was not. So I've had 5 agents, literary agents for it. It wasn't selling in the U.S. Like I said, it's set against the Kashmir conflict, and there were many editors who said, you know, it's too bad it wasn't the war du jour at that time, Iraq or Afghanistan, and they said Americans wouldn't be interested in reading about this particular piece of geography, which I think is almost a catch-22, because if you don't put something on the shelf, you won't know if anyone's interested in reading it. So it was having a hard time being picked up over here. And it finally got published in India with a small press. And this was 5 years ago, almost a little more than 5 years ago. The publishing world has changed a lot in these 5 years. We have a lot of smaller new presses, which are doing incredibly well, which were not really available back when I was trying to get this published. Now, when I published Isolated Incident in India, I did not even think to have a book launch or anything here, because I figured, it's not here, how will I sell it, what will happen? But now people who published in India, you know, bring copies of their own over here, sell them, they do their book talks, they do everything. With Unmarriageable, like I said, I wrote it. My literary agent sold it within weeks to Penguin Random House, which is a big publisher over here. And I think every author should at least once in their lifetime be published by a big publisher, just to see how that is, what the journey is like. It's been very nice so far. My editor has been amazing. I was a little scared, given that there's a wedding in this novel. There's so much that could be exotified in Unmarriageable, and never once was I made to feel that I needed to do this, or I needed to say this, or I needed to spruce up, you know, anything of the sort. Everything in the novel is what I wanted to keep. There is one, there is only one thing that I regret editing out. Unmarriageable is set in a fictitious town, Dilipabad. I gave myself that break also. I was like, I don't have time to go back to Pakistan, research a real, you know, so my Bennetts live in this fictitious town, Dilipabad, which is a composite perhaps of every small town everywhere. But and I had an origin history of the name, of how that town got to be Dilipabad, because Dilip is a Hindu name, and this is and the town wanted to change their name from the British name that the British Empire had given it, and they wanted to Islamicize the name, but they ended up with Dilipabad. So I'd given a whole history of how this happened, how this town became Dilipabad, and unfortunately I chose to edit it out because I thought it was impeding the pacing, and now I'm like, dash it. But, you know, I hope to hopefully publish it somewhere or the other. So, so no, the publishing world has changed a lot. Big publishers can give you, of course, you get some marketing, a lot more exposure, but smaller publishers, I think, can do that too now. It really depends on honestly, it comes down to to be absolutely bare bones about it, it depends who makes an offer, you know. Usually the thing is, if one of the big fives makes an offer, who says no? However, that said, nowadays I think that the smaller publishers are able to do such. And it used to be that if you were published by a smaller publisher, you wouldn't even get any review space. That has completely changed. I think once some of the smaller, there was this book that was published with Bellevue Press, I think, out of Johns Hopkins a few years ago, called Tinkers, and it won the Pulitzer. And then suddenly it started getting, you know, reviewed everywhere. And so I think even for the smaller publishers now, you get a lot more reviews, which you otherwise wouldn't have. And I think the internet has been a game changer in that too, because even if you don't get the New York Times or the Washington Post or those reviews, there's still Bookstagram, there's Instagram, there's, you know, there's still bloggers, there's people do book videos now and stuff. There's still ways to get your book out there and to get your name and book in front of readers, which is what you wanted to do which is why most people wanted to go with the big publisher, so that you'd get more marketing and stuff. And you know, I've been lucky with Unmarriageable. It was NPR gave it a great review, and it was a People magazine's pick and one of Amazon's best books, and you know, it did really well and stuff. And I think a lot of that though is it's word of mouth also. I think at the end of the day, no matter what publisher you go with, it's really word of mouth. I'll tell you what the big thing I think these days is to really push a book is if Oprah picks you, if Reese picks you, or one of the morning shows, or you know, a celebrity if Obama decides to read your book, or one, you know, if a celebrity does, I think nowadays those are what can really push a book forward. Those are just, I mean, it's just pure luck and chance. What can you do, you know? It's one. I mean, I'm very balanced with my reviews. A review is one person's opinion. A pick is one person's opinion. They either like your book, they don't like your book, and so I don't know if that answered your question at all. So, yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for someone who's writing books in the multicultural realm? My husband's from Korea, and so you know, we've been married 9 years, and we're always talking about cross-cultural stuff. We actually were able to write 3 children's books, one that's set in the U.S. and 2, one in China and Korea. But you know, when we've worked with like people from SC and PWI and done mentorships and things like that, but I have a 2-month-old baby, and we're trying to find out how to kind of move forward. And I didn't know if you had any practical advice, because you know, it's a little daunting to write 50 emails to 50 literary agents, and our books are really to bring people to a better knowledge of like multicultural issues, especially, you know, we see stuff on the news, but we really want to put in children's hearts the love of like that identity, and you know, where all our children are going to be look different, and you know, so do you have any tips for approaching
Agents,
or just, you know, publishing? You know, we have a contact in Pakistan, actually. We could publish there, or we could publish somewhere in Korea, but we're not, it seems more tailored even to an American audience too, because,
you know, and if you live here, I think you should try your home, you know, where you live first, because it's just much easier to do your book tours, to do your things when you're in that particular country, rather than flying overseas for everything. But you know, I think like you've said, if you've already been approaching 50 agents and sending out query letters, that's really the only way to do it. There's always self-publishing, which is another avenue, which it used to be really taboo, but I think more and more people are opting for that route, depending on where they see their book, where they see their, you know, where they see their career, where they see that particular book. But otherwise, yeah, that's the only way to go about it, is to send query letters out to lit agents. And sometimes it can take years to find an agent, and then it can take years to find an editor, and then, you know, and sometimes it can take a minute. It just depends on who your work resonates with. Once again, this is a very subjective industry, you know. I mean, it's like a movie. Imagine, you know, you go to watch a movie, you could love the movie, your husband could hate the movie, neither one of you is right per se, you know. You're just bringing your own background, your own aesthetics, your own preferences to that particular thing. So it's the same with books. Just because, you know, if you've sent out so many query letters and you haven't had any responses yet, or anyone wanting to see the books, it's just it hasn't reached the right set of eyes yet. You know, given that, you know, you've written it, you've vetted it, you've had people read it, other writers and stuff read it, people think it's really good. Kids, you know, well, I know with a lot of, I mean, I don't write kids' books yet, but my kids would like me to write one. But, you know, reading a kid book out to a kid, and if you're able to sustain their attention, you have something there, I feel. So, yeah.
Would everyone join me in thanking her for coming this evening?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And we are very appreciative to Liberty Books for the wonderful coffee, for this gorgeous store. For everyone watching this on the Vimeo, please check out Liberty Books in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Thank you again. She will be here for a few minutes. Come up and meet her, please.
Yeah, and I'd also like to add that, yes, thank you so much, Liberty Books. Thank you to Gwinnett County, to Denise, to everyone who invited me here. Please, I'm on Facebook author page, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. You're welcome to friend me on any of these mediums. And if you like the book, if you like the book, then please do leave reviews on Amazon and Goodreads. All of us authors really, really appreciate, even if it's just the stars, when you go that extra step, if you've liked our work, to please do that. So thank you so much.